It started on a crisp autumn morning when the mountain air smelled like pine needles and wood smoke. The kind of morning where my cabin usually felt like the safest. It's the most private retreat in the world. But on that day, as I walked down the gravel path with a mug of coffee in my hand, I stopped cold at the sight of three strangers standing on my porch with a fourth pointing toward my windows as if giving a tour. And at first I thought maybe they were hikers who had lost their way. But then I saw the sharp-dressed man in a suit with a leather binder under his arm, and it clicked he was a realtor. Gesturing to my cabin like it was listed on the market, like my home, my sanctuary, was up for sale without my knowledge or permission. When I strode forward, demanding to know what they were doing, he looked surprised but not ashamed, telling me the Homeowners Association had reached out to him to schedule viewings since the property was listed as available, and my gut twisted with the familiar anger I'd grown to associate with the HOA in this mountain community. Because from the day I bought this land, I had refused to join their ridiculous little empire of control and fines. Knowing my deed was ironclad, and my cabin predated their formation, their smug president, a woman named Carol, never let me forget that she believed all properties within her community were subject to her board's rules, and here was the latest proof of her overreach, brazen enough to invite strangers to tour my home as if she owned it, as if my rights were just a suggestion she could cross out with a pen. And I stood there clenching my fists as the realtor shuffled, insisting that if this was a mistake, he'd clear it up. But the fact he had documents that he spoke with such confidence told me the HOA had forged or fabricated papers to make. It looked like my cabin was theirs to sell, and the thought of someone casually walking through my living room, fingering the family photos on the mantle, or opening drawers in my kitchen made my blood boil, because this wasn't just a scam, it was a violation, and I told the strangers they had 1 minute to get off my land before I called the sheriff. And though they left with confused apologies, I saw suspicion flicker in their eyes, as if wondering whether I was really the intruder in this equation. Which was exactly the kind of seed the HOA wanted to plant, that I was the outlier, the stubborn holdout, the squatter in their planned community. And after they were gone, I sat on the porch swing trying to calm down, sipping coffee gone cold, replaying every warning sign I'd ignored over the past year, how the HOA had mailed me fines for unkempt landscaping even though my cabin sat on forest land exempt from their codes, how Carol had stood on my driveway telling me eventually, "We'll bring everything under the board's umbrella. It's only a matter of time." How one of their newsletters had even listed upcoming available properties, with a vague description that suspiciously matched mine, and it all came together now like puzzle pieces snapping into place, proving they had finally crossed from harassment into outright fraud. And yet I knew storming over to Carol's mansion or screaming at the next board meeting would only give them ammunition, because the HOA thrived on appearances and drama, twisting every confrontation into proof of why the community needed their control. So instead, I decided then and there to play a slower, smarter game, but not before taking back the most basic security of all, the locks on my doors, because if they had the gall to invite a realtor onto my porch, who knew if they'd made copies of my keys from some shady locksmith or broken in while I was away. And so I drove into town that very afternoon, bought a heavy-duty deadbolt system, security cameras, and a thick steel mailbox to replace the flimsy one that the HOA always seemed to accidentally open. And by evening, the warm glow of my cabin was accompanied by the whir of a power drill as I replaced every lock, the sound echoing like defiance against the quiet forest. And when the last bolt clicked into place, I stepped outside with a can of red spray paint and a big wooden board I'd found in my shed, painting in bold letters that dripped like warning blood, "Not for sale, owner lives here," and I planted it right at the end of my gravel driveway where the realtor and the HOA couldn't miss it. A message not just to them but to myself, a reminder that no matter what games they played, this was my cabin, my land, my fight, and they had just awakened something in me that wasn't going to back down. Yet even as the spray-painted words dried under the dim light of dusk, I knew the battle had only just begun, because the HOA wasn't the type to tuck its tail and slink away when someone stood up to them. No, Carol and her board thrived on escalation, feeding on the drama like vultures circling a carcass. and I could already imagine her expression when she drove by and saw my sign. That tight smile she wore whenever she thought she was in control, snapping into a scowl when she realized I had flipped the script. But still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my gut, because if they were bold enough to list my cabin for sale once, what was stopping them from trying again? Forging new paperwork, leaning on some corrupt county clerk to lose my deed, or even slipping a notice of eminent domain into my mailbox claiming they had the authority to seize my land. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about one scam. It was about power. And people like Carol didn't stop until someone forced them to, which meant I had to prepare for the long game. And so that night I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of old property records, the deed to my land, and a recorder documenting every word of what had happened, not just for my own sanity, but as a record to use later when the time came to take this fight public. Because the HOA thrived in the shadows, twisting truth behind closed doors. But if I dragged their actions into the light where neighbors, county officials, and even the media could see, then their empire of intimidation would crumble. And as the clock ticked past midnight with the forest outside my window whispering in the wind, I felt the weight of exhaustion but also a fire in my chest. A fire that had been lit the moment I saw that realtor pointing at my windows like my home was nothing but inventory. And that fire told me one thing with clarity. They had picked the wrong cabin, the wrong owner, the wrong fight, because I wasn't going anywhere, and if they wanted a war, I was more than ready to give them one. The next morning, after I hammered the sign into the ground, I half expected peace to settle over the cabin, kind of silence that said my message had been received, loud and clear. But instead, the silence that greeted me was the kind of heavy stillness before a storm, because when I stepped outside, there was a neatly folded envelope pinned to my mailbox with a red sticker that read "Urgent HOA Business." And I didn't need to open it to know it was the first shot of retaliation. Though of course I opened it anyway and found exactly what I predicted. A notice of fines amounting to nearly $2,000 for defacement of community property, improper signage, and non-compliance with architectural standards written in that smug bureaucratic language the HOA used to make theft sound like order, and at the bottom was Carol's signature in thick blue ink, as though she had personally enjoyed authorizing it. And I laughed out loud in disbelief, because not only was my land not theirs to regulate, but my sign sat on my private driveway, nowhere near their so-called community property. Yet here they were trying to fine me for daring to stand my ground, and I realized with cold certainty that this was only the beginning. Because people like Carol didn't respond to resistance with compromise, they escalated, and sure enough, later that week I came home from a supply run to find a car idling in front of my cabin, the same realtor stepping out with a stack of papers in his hand, confusion written all over his face as he stammered that the HOA had assured him the listing was still valid and that my angry outburst the first time had been nothing but a misunderstanding, and when I demanded to see the papers, he reluctantly handed them over, revealing documents that looked disturbingly official fake purchase agreements, a forged power of attorney that claimed to bear my signature, and even a falsified county stamp, all of which I recognized as blatant forgeries, but which could, at a glance, fool someone less familiar with my deed. Ow. And it was in that moment I saw the deeper danger. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a campaign to erase me from my own land. And if they were willing to forge my signature once, who was to say they wouldn't take it further, filing fraudulent deeds at the recorder's office, trying to sell my home outright to some unsuspecting buyer, creating a legal nightmare where I'd be forced to defend what was rightfully mine in a maze of courts and red tape? And so instead of losing my temper with the realtor, I calmed myself, told him I understood his confusion, and asked if he would mind telling me everything the HOA had promised him. And though hesitant at first, he eventually admitted that Carol and two other board members had presented themselves as authorized community trustees and claimed my property had been voluntarily surrendered as part of a redevelopment plan. And as he spoke, I recorded every word on my phone, keeping my voice steady, pretending to be sympathetic while inside I was burning with rage. And when he finally realized how badly he had been duped, his face paled and he swore he would never step foot on my property again. But I didn't care about his promises anymore because I already had what I needed: evidence. The first piece of a chain I intended to wrap around the HOA's throat until they had no room left to wriggle free. And that night I stayed up late poring over property records at the county's online archive, following threads of complaints buried in the fine print. And what I found sickened my neighbors, who had mysteriously sold their lots only to move out within months. Elderly couples whose homes had been foreclosed after unpaid fines ballooned into liens. And entire parcels of land that had been absorbed into HOA control through shady transfers that no honest lawyer would ever have signed off on. And the pattern was clear. Carol and her cronies had built their power not through community service, but through quiet theft, one forged signature, and one intimidated family at a time. And now they had set their sights on me. But what they hadn't realized was that I wasn't going to fold. Because unlike the neighbors who had bowed their heads, in silence, I had both the resources and the will to fight back. And so I began documenting everything with precision. Photographing the sign each morning to prove it remained intact on my land, scanning the fine notices they stuffed into my mailbox, saving voicemail threats that came from blocked numbers but carried voices I recognized from HOA meetings, and, most importantly, I set up hidden cameras around my property, small black eyes tucked into tree trunks and under the eaves of my cabin, watching not just the front driveway, but the woods behind the house too. Because if they had already tried to send a realtor once, I wouldn't put it past them to attempt something worse, like breaking in at night. And sure enough, my paranoia proved justified when, 2 weeks later, I woke in the dead of night to the sound of gravel crunching under tires. And I slipped from bed to peer out the window only to see two men I recognized as HOA board members standing near my mailbox with flashlights, photographing my not-for-sale sign and muttering to each other. And though they left after a few minutes, I had the whole thing captured in crisp detail on my cameras there. Smug faces lit up by their own beams, and as I replayed the footage the next morning, I knew exactly how I would use it. Not immediately, but later, at the perfect moment when they least expected it. Because timing in a fight like this was everything. If I struck too soon, they'd wriggle away. But if I waited until their arrogance piled high enough, until they felt untouchable, then one strike could topple the entire tower they had built on lies. And so I continued my routine, outwardly calm but inwardly calculating. Recording board meetings on my phone when I dropped by as a concerned neighbor, scanning every newsletter for language that hinted at their next target, quietly gathering a dossier of fraud, and with each passing week I felt my case growing stronger, while at the same time their harassment grew bolder. Strange cars parked on the shoulder near my cabin. Anonymous letters slipped under my door warning me to comply before it's too late. And even one incident where my water line was mysteriously shut off, but only for the utility company to confirm the order had been placed, not by me, but by a community representative. And though they restored it quickly once I raised hell, the message was clear. They were testing me, probing for weaknesses. And every test they threw at me only steeled my resolve further, until finally the day came when I realized I had enough to go on the offensive. Because in my binder now sat a mountain of evidence: video of board members trespassing, audio of the realtor describing their fraud, letters with Carol's signature authorizing illegal fines, and records from the county showing suspicious transfers of land, linked back to her family's development company. And as I laid it all out across my table one evening, the firelight dancing on the pages like the flames of judgment itself, I felt the weight of inevitability settle on my shoulders, because the time for patience was ending, the time for war was beginning. In Section 2 of this battle, the chapter where I endured their intimidation and quietly sharpened my weapons, was over, and what came next would be the reckoning they never saw coming. The morning I decided to unleash everything I had gathered dawned gray and heavy, clouds hanging low over the mountains, as if the sky itself knew what was about to come crashing down. And as I loaded the thick binder of evidence into the back of my truck, I felt a calmness that hadn't touched me in months, because the fear and anger were gone now, replaced by clarity, by the knowledge that every moment of harassment, every forged paper, every trespass had built to this reckoning. And I drove into town not as a victim, but as an executioner, carrying the weight of judgment. pulling up first at the county recorder's office where I requested an emergency appointment with the clerk. Sliding across the table copies of the fraudulent deeds, forged signatures, and the video of the realtor admitting what Carol had told him, and as the clerk watched the footage, her expression hardened, shifting from confusion to anger to resolve, and she told me flatly that what I had uncovered was not just an HOA dispute, but potential felony fraud. The kind of thing that would draw in the sheriff and district attorney, and she excused herself to make a call while I sat there tapping my fingers on the binder, feeling the anticipation coil in my chest like a spring about to release, and within an hour I was sitting across from Sheriff Douglas himself, a broad-shouldered man with a reputation for hating corruption. And as I laid out my evidence, he leaned back, arms crossed, then leaned forward, jaw tight, finally slamming his hand on the table and saying, "I've had my suspicions about that woman for years, but this is enough to bring the whole house down," and hearing those words felt like the first breath of freedom after months underwater. And from there, things moved quickly. The sheriff assembling a task force, the DA's office drafting subpoenas, and me quietly reaching out to neighbors I knew had suffered under Carol's reign, showing them pieces of the evidence until they too agreed to testify, till what had once been whispers of resentment in the community became a chorus of voices, ready to rise up. And when the day of the reckoning arrived, it unfolded like a storm, sudden and unstoppable. With sheriff's deputies marching up the HOA office steps, carrying boxes for evidence, Carol sputtering as she tried to wave her manicured hands and talk her way out of it, only to be silenced by the cold slap of a warrant, while at the same time the realtor, now fully aware of how close he had come to losing his license and freedom, gave a sworn statement under oath that the HOA had misled him and produced forged documents. His testimony, the final nail in the coffin of their defense, and as words spread, neighbors poured into the streets. Some angry, some jubilant, but all watching as the so-called rulers of their community were led out in handcuffs, their empire collapsing in the bright light of justice. And through it all, I stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, not gloating, but steady. Because this wasn't about triumph over them so much as it was about reclaiming what was mine, proving that no amount of signatures on fake paper could erase the truth of my ownership. And when the dust settled, when Carol and her cronies were indicted on charges ranging from fraud to racketeering, when the HOA was dissolved by court order and its assets seized to repay the families it had wronged, I finally returned to my cabin, the air crisp again, the forest quiet, my home standing strong against the backdrop of mountains. And I pulled that old spray-painted board out of the ground one last time, dragging it to my fire pit, watching as flames licked up the red letters until the words "Not for sale" curled into smoke, and I thought about how fitting it was that the only sign left standing was the cabin itself. Weathered but unbroken, just like me. And as the fire crackled and the sun dipped low behind the ridgeline, I leaned back in my chair, a glass of bourbon in hand, and allowed myself to finally fully exhale, knowing the war was over, the land was mine, the lies had been burned away, and the HOA that once thought they could sell my life out from under me had instead sold their own souls to greed, only to watch them consumed in the blaze of justice they never saw coming. For weeks after the arrests and the firelit victory in which I burned that cursed not-for-sale board to ash, I lived in a strange, almost unreal calm, walking my cabin's grounds with a sense of finality, certain that Carol and her board's downfall meant the end of the nightmare. Yet as the days stretched on into winter, I began to notice things that didn't fit the peace I expected. Black SUVs without plates idling too long on the mountain road before disappearing around bends. Construction survey markers driven quietly into the soil at the far edges of my land. And neighbors whispering about strangers in tailored suits knocking on doors offering cash for deeds. And though at first I thought it was just paranoia left over from my war with the HOA, the truth revealed itself one evening when I received a manila envelope slid under my cabin door. Unmarked, but heavy, containing copies of contracts, blueprints, and correspondence that made my blood run cold, because what I held was evidence that the HOA had never been the true mastermind behind the attempted theft of my land. They had been pawns. A petty front for something far larger, a corporation called Silver Pine Development, whose slick letterheads promised mountain luxury expansion, but whose plans laid out in sterile detail an entire resort complex, complete with luxury chalets, ski lifts, private roads, and a golf course, all sprawled across the ridgeline where my cabin sat, marked in red ink as Phase 1 acquisition. And the deeper I read, the more I understood. The HOA's fraud had been a small cog in a far greater scheme, a tool to bleed out independent landowners like me until we gave up or were forced out. And Carol, arrogant as she had been, was only the puppet dancing on strings tied to people with far more money, influence, and reach than I had ever imagined. And I realized with a sick twist of irony that her arrest might not have ended the war but instead triggered the next phase. Because buried in the stack of documents was a plea agreement draft where Carol herself, in exchange for a reduced sentence, had begun naming names, and those names were not just her board members but county officials, lawyers, and even a state senator, all of whom had allegedly greased wheels to let Silver Pine operate unchecked. And though part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of being dragged into a battle that stretched beyond one corrupt HOA into the veins of government itself, another part of me hardened, because I knew what I was looking at wasn't absurd at all. It was the inevitable rot that grows when greed goes unchecked. My small victory had only peeled back the surface, exposing a hydra beneath a beast. That wouldn't fall from one strike, but would lash out twice as hard for every head cut off. And sure enough, the retaliation came quietly, but unmistakably. With my mailbox pried open and emptied again, my security cameras cut from their wires in the night, and anonymous letters warning me that I had no idea who I was dealing with, written in block print and sealed with greasy fingerprints. And yet instead of fear, I felt that same fire rekindle inside me. Because if Silver Pine thought I would roll over, they had chosen the wrong mountain, the wrong cabin, the wrong man again. And so I began preparing, not just to defend my land, but to escalate the war to the scale it deserved, expanding my dossier with every scrap of evidence, reaching out not only to the sheriff who had stood by me before, but to journalists, land rights attorneys, and state investigators, knowing that to fight an enemy with endless pockets, I had to bring the battle into the open, into the court of public opinion where shadows lose their power. As snow began to blanket the mountain and my cabin glowed warm against the cold, I stood at the porch rail with binoculars scanning the distant survey markers, thinking how strange it was that what began as an HOA trying to list my cabin for sale had unraveled into a conspiracy that reached into government halls. And I understood. Then that Section 4 of this war wasn't about survival anymore. It was about exposing something rotten at the very heart of the system, a fight bigger than me, bigger than my land, a fight for the very mountain itself. And as the wind howled through the trees and carried the scent of snow, I whispered into the dark that I was ready. Because though they had more money, more power, more men, they had underestimated one thing: my resolve to defend what was mine until the very last breath. And if they wanted this land, they would have to come and take it from me with the world watching.